Victorian age continued. The Victorian British Empire. The Victorian British Empire dominated the globe, though its forms of rule and influence were uneven and diverse. The traffic of people and goods between Britain and its colonies was constant, complex, and multi-directional. Britain shaped the empire shaped Britain, and colonies shaped one another. British jobs abroad included civil and military service, missionary work, and infrastructure development. People from various imperial locations traveled to, studied in, and settled in Britain. Money too flowed both ways. The empire was a source of profit, and emigrants sent money home to Britain, as did goods such as jute, calico, cotton cloth, and tea. Dramatic expansion of the empire meant that such goods came to Britain from all over the world. Between 1820 and 1870s, the empire grew, shifted its orientation eastward, and increased the number of non-white people over whom it exerted control. Much of this expansion involved violence, including the Indian Mutiny that from 1857 to 59, the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865 in Jamaica, the Opium Wars that they were from 1839 to 42 and 1856 to 60 in China, and the Taranaki War from 1860 to 61 in New Zealand. India became central to imperial status and wealth. There was significant migration to the settler colonies of Australia and New Zealand and later to Canada and South Africa. From 1870 until 1914, continued aggressive expansion, including Britain's participation in the so-called Scramble for Africa, was assisted by new technologies including railways and telegraphy. Britain took control of large parts of Africa, including Egypt, Sudan, and Kenya, which together were home to about 30% of the African population. The same period also saw the start of anti colonial movements that demand freedom from British domination in India and elsewhere. These would ultimately lead to decolonization after World War II. The Victorian British economy. Britain's status as a world political power was bolstered by a strong economy which grew rapidly between 1820 and 1873. This half century of growth was followed by an economic depression and from 1896 until 1914 by a modest recovery. With the earliest phases of industrialization over by about 1840, the British economy expanded. Britain became the richest country in the world, but many people worked long hours in harsh conditions. Yet overall standards of living were rising. While the 1840s were a bad time for workers and the poor, they were dubbed the Hungry Forties. Overall, the trend was towards a less precarious life. Most families not only had a home and enough to eat, but also had something left over for alcohol, tobacco, and even vacations to the countryside or the seaside. Of course, some decades were times of plenty, others of want. Relative prosperity meant that Britain was a nation not only of shopkeepers but of shoppers, with the rise of the department stores from mid century transforming the shopping experience. Increased wealth, including higher real wages from the 1870, meant that even working class people could purchase discretionary items. Mass production meant that clothes, souvenirs, newspapers, and more were affordable to almost everyone. Victorian culture and art. More access made British cultural products more important. Not only did they reveal much about the society from which they emerged, but during the Victorian period, Britain was the cultural capital of the English speaking world, including the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Victorian performance and print culture were rich and varied, a blend of melodrama, spectacle, and morality. Theatre thrived. Melodrama, which featured evil villains, virtuous heroines, and intricate plots, was the most important and most popular genre early on. Later, sensation drama became popular. Even more popular were music halls, which featured varied programs of singing, dancing, sketch, and more. These emerged in the 1850s, and by the 1870s there were hundreds across Britain, some seating thousands of people. Music halls attracted people of all classes. Print culture was also large and diverse, aided by relatively high literacy rates. There were hundreds of magazines and newspapers available at even cheaper, ever cheaper prices. The 1880s saw the emergence of the new journalism, which drew in readers with pieces on violent crimes and scandals in high society. Novels were another key features of Victorian print culture. By mid century, Britons of all classes could afford and read novels. Some were aimed at highly educated and well-off people, others at less educated readers looking for appealing and exciting stories. Penny, dreadful, and sensation novels, seen at their best in the works of Wilkie Collins, thrilled their readers. Victorian novels were often quite long with complicated plots, often centered on marriages and many characters. Many, especially those by Charles Dickens, are still read today. The novel. The Victorian era was the great age of the English novel, realistic, thickly plotted, crowded with characters and long. It was the ideal form to describe contemporary life and to entertain the middle class. The novels of Charles Dickens, full to overflowing with drama, humor, and an endless variety of vivid characters and plot complications, nonetheless spare nothing in their portrayal of what urban life was like for all classes. William Makepeace Thackeray is best known for Vanity Fair (1848), which wickedly satirizes hypocrisy and greed. Emily Bronte's uh, family single novel Wuthering Heights (1847) is a unique masterpiece propelled by a vision of elemental passions but controlled by an uncompromising artistic sense. The fine novels of Emily's sister Charlotte Bronte, especially Jane Eyre (1847) and Villette (1853), are more rooted in convention but daring in their own ways. The novels of George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans, appeared during the 1860s and 70s. A woman of great erudition and moral fervor, Eliot was concerned with ethical conflicts and social problems. George Meredith produced comic novels noted for their psychological perception. Another novelist of the late 19th century was the prolific Antony Trollope, famous for sequences of related novels that explore social, ecclesiastical, and political life in England. Thomas Hardy's profoundly pessimistic novels are all set in the harsh, punishing Midland country he called Wessex. Samuel Butler produced novels satirizing the Victorian ethos, and Robert Louis Stevenson, a master of his craft, wrote arresting adventure fiction in children's verse. The mathematician Charles Ludwig Dodgson, writing under the name Lewis Carroll, produced the complex and sophisticated children's classic Alice's Adventures in Wonderland (1865) and Through the Looking Glass (1871). Lesser novelists of considerable merit include Benjamin Disraeli, George Gissing, Elizabeth Gaskell, and Wilkie Collins. By the end of the period, the novel was considered not only the premier form of entertainment but also a primary means of analyzing and offering solutions to social and political problems. Non-fiction. Among the Victorian masters of non-fiction were the great Whig historian Thomas Macaulay and Thomas Carlyle, the historian, social critic, and prophet whose rhetoric thundered through the age. Influential thinkers included John Stuart Mill, the great liberal scholar and philosopher, Thomas Henry Huxley, a scientist and popularizer of Darwinian theory, and John Henry Cardinal Newman, who wrote earnestly of religion, philosophy, and education. The founders of communism, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, researched and wrote their books in the free environment of England. The great art historian and critic John Ruskin also concerned himself with social and economic problems Matthew Arnold's theories of literature and culture laid the foundations for modern literary criticism, and his poetry is also notable. Poetry. The prominent poet of the Victorian age was Alfred Lord Tennyson. Although romantic in subject matter, his poetry was tempered by personal melancholy. In its mixture of social certitude and religious doubt, it reflected the age. The poetry of Robert Browning and his wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, was immensely popular, though Elizabeth's was more venerated during their lifetimes. Browning is best remembered for his superb dramatic monologue. Rudyard Kipling, the poet of the Empire Triumphant, captured the quality of the life of the soldiers of British expansion. Some fine religious poetry was produced by Francis Thompson, Alice Meynell, Christina Rossetti, and Lionel Johnson. In the middle of the 19th century, the so-called Pre-Raphaelites, led by the painter-poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti, so ought to revive what they judged to be the simple natural values and techniques of medieval life and art. The quest for a rich symbolic art led them away, however, from the mainstream. William Morris, designer, inventor, printer, poet, and social philosopher, was the most versatile of the group, which included the poets Christina Rossetti and Coventry Petmore. Algernon Charles Swinburne began as a pre-Raphaelite poet, but soon developed his own classically influenced, sometimes florid style. A. Houseman and Thomas Hardy, Victorian figures who lived on into the 20th century, share a pessimistic view in their poetry, but Houseman's well-constructed verse is rather more superficial. The great innovator among the late Victorian poets was the Jesuit priest Gerard Manley Hopkins. The concentration and originality of his imagery, as well as his jolting meter, sprung rhythm, had a profound effect on the 20th century poetry. During the 1890s, the most conspicuous figure on the English literary scene were the decadents. The principal figures in the group were Arthur Symons, Ernest Dowson, and first among them is both notoriety and talent, Oscar Wilde. The decadents, disgust with bourgeois complacency, led them to extremes of behavior and expression. However limited their accomplishments, they pointed out the hypocrisies in Victorian values and institutions. The sparkling, witty comedies of Oscar Wilde and the comic operettas of W. S. Gilbert and Sir Arthur Sullivan were perhaps the brightest achievements of the 19th century British drama.